nás vlastně zajímá nejvíc, a to je vědecké studium Arménie. První částí našeho setkání jsou úvodní referáty, neboli keynote speakers, jak by se řeklo anglicky. A první z nich přednese pan doktor Haig Utidjian, který je vlastně Armenian Chair, je to ani nepřekládané do češtiny, a který se bude zabývat otázkou Research and Teaching in Armenian Studies in Prague, recent endeavours, early fruits and expectations for the future.
Děkuji mnohokrát, pane docente, vaše excelence, dámy a pánové. Dovolíte-li, hodlám přednášet tentokrát v angličtině, doufám, že tímto způsobem budu pochopitelný pro širší kategorie posluchačů. So I shall proceed in English, if I may. I shall merely try briefly to outline some of the research and teaching in Armenian studies that I have personally been involved in, and finish by indicating some of our hopes and expectations for the future. This research endeavour has been interdisciplinary. It has moved within the realm of Armenian studies, but with very substantial overlaps with musicology, perhaps with the ethnomusicology to a lesser degree, philology, theology, and elements of art history, because much Armenian culture involves these things bundled up together, and these things can shed light on each other if considered in tandem with each other. Something about the underlying principles all these endeavours have in common. The search for primary sources and their critical re-examination from neglected angles. The word critical is important here, a critical approach that sometimes, if necessary, challenges the self-limiting narratives of the past, can be very fruitful. This has included also some fieldwork to capture the tail end of oral traditions that are on the verge of disappearance, particularly those in San Lazzaro in Venice and in Istanbul, the former historical Armenian Constantinople. The milieu of Constantinople leads us to the next point, which is that this research has always sought a very full exploration of interactions and analogies with neighboring traditions. And music, poetry, theological and philosophical thought, and visual culture taken all together, for example, such as when they are to be found in liturgical deployment, to reinforce and shed light on each other. Furthermore, this work focuses, amongst other things, on the 19th century as a sort of telescope, as a window through which to view the more distant past. This work has been done with a keen awareness of the benefits accruing from a digital humanities approach and software tools, and the aim has been not only the restoration and revival of literary and artistic monuments based on a collation of documentary witnesses, but also as part of an organic tradition which has, for example, oral elements in many cases, and finally seeking the value and inspiration they may accord us in our own time. The first of these areas is the work of the 10th century poet, mystic, and saint, Saint Gregory of Narew, who was recently, as you know, proclaimed by Pope Francis as the Doctor of the Universal Church. My interest particularly has been centering of late on the corpus of odes by the saint. This corpus is less well studied than, for example, the very well-known book of Lamentation of the saint, his penitential prayer book. And it embodies some of the finest Armenian poetry in existence, perhaps arguably some of the finest poetry in existence in any language, yet remains overshadowed by the saint's other writings. One problem is the absence of satisfactory editions and the numerous obscurities in the text, which have been a major impediment until very recently. Philology has hitherto neglected the valuable hints provided by the musical pneumatic notation, even though we cannot decipher the neumes to find out what melodies were sung, there are valuable hints that we can derive from them as sort of detective work that gives us some information. And variously notated melodies transcribed from the oral tradition in the 19th century have also remained dormant and forgotten in various collections. Even modest progress in these areas has been crucial and would greatly enhance the canon of Armenian literature and music. The odes are miniature masterpieces representing a very different aspect of their author's personality and are highly appealing in their modernity, sometimes reading like avant-garde French or Czech poetry from the beginning of the 20th century even. Research so far, I have been able to identify and exploit neglected early manuscript witnesses, as well as returning to known sources warranting re-examination, clarified various latent or misunderstood biblical and classical literary allusions, carried out an unprecedented analysis of pneumatic notation found in the earliest codices, albeit substantially post-dating the author's own lifetime, to expose metrical features. And then the neumes can be pressed into service to help us in various ways. For example, exposing the verbal and musical structure, and crucially, serving as an aid in the assessment of competing variant readings. Early fruits of this work have involved the emergence of hitherto unknown stanzas in the ode Sain ein Ichaner, for example, the reinstatement of unjustly ignored textual variants, the elucidation of misunderstood passages, the demonstration of the usefulness of the undeciphered musical notation, the revelation of distinct layers of metrical structure associated with the neumes, associated with the verbal text, and associated with the melodies that we have, which often correspond to three very different things, and the revelation of tantalizing hints such as, for example, the fact that medieval scribes appear to have compensated for divergent numbers of syllables in verses incorporating neumes by lengthening and shortening the durations of particular syllables. And anomalies in the meter have been seen to correspond to bifurcations in phylogenetic trees. In the medium term, what can we hope? It would be desirable to develop stemmas for individual odes and for major collections, assess the degree of correlation between the extant melodies and the pneumatic notation, and seek to correlate the stemmas for verbal text with stemmas for the neumes. Such work has been done in the Byzantine tradition, but is completely new in the Armenian sacred musical tradition. In the longer term, we should seek to elucidate the modes of text transmission which involve clearly gaps in the manuscript transmission, which were bridged by memory and the oral tradition. We desperately need a reliable critical edition, exploiting perhaps a variety of different approaches for different groups of odes, making use of digital humanities tools such as the classical text editor and stematological software, new translations into modern languages, including the Czech language, and fuller studies of the multivalent symbolism and the exegetical function of the corpus. The publication of a popularizing volume is well on its way, providing helpful signposts for the modern reader. Now, I shall proceed to the next area of research interest to me, and that's that of Armenian sacred music, corpora, centers, notations, interactions. The significance of this work cannot be overstated. Armenian sacred music affords one of the richest legacies of the nation to humanity, yet it continues to remain full of tantalizing open problems of international significance. Progress also promises considerable artistic rewards. Collation has been carried out between different corpora, comparative study and analysis from various centers and in a variety of notational systems, including fieldwork on oral traditions in Istanbul, Venice and Vienna in Armenian monasteries, embracing also early archival recordings. Studies have been made of interactions with neighboring traditions on the basis of documentary witnesses, with some rather surprising findings. A reconstruction has been achieved revealing many of the procedures of redactors of the Armenian hymnal in the 19th century, and a study has been undertaken of the course of westernization and changes in taste and aesthetics. These are some early fruits. On the left-hand side, you can see an Armenian ode by Grigor Kavasakalian, which until very recently could not be read. The melody could not be deciphered. I was fortunate enough, with the help of my colleague Christian Troskard in Copenhagen, to associate this with a Byzantine hymnos by Petros the Peloponnesian, exactly the same melody, thereby revealing that the Armenian was a contrafactum of the Byzantine Greek, and revealing the secrets of Kavasakalian's notation, which had been unknown for 2 centuries. On the right-hand side, you can find a Princeton University manuscript of an Armenian introit in the Greek Chrysanthine notation. There is no comparable example known within the Armenian tradition now, so the Greek transcription actually rescued an important example, but there are antecedents in medieval manuscripts, such as the one below, which I photographed in Vienna, which is densely numerated. The 2 melodies do not, alas, correspond to each other. They can't possibly do so, but they belong to the same tradition. I would say the Greek manuscript comes from the tail end of the same tradition. And in the middle bottom, you can see my transcription of a melody I heard sung in Vienna, which corresponds to the Greek hymn Phos Ilaron, and is based on a Greek Constantinopolitan melody that is no longer known by most Greek practitioners even. An understanding of the manner in which notational systems were deployed in the 19th century, a comparison with contemporaneous transcriptions in Western staff notation, and intonation nuances preserved in early recordings that find parallels in the Ottoman classical instrumental tradition, in collaboration with Jacob Early of Cambridge University, have elucidated the significance of various aspects of the notational system that were not known. But we have the broader objective of reconstructing some of the musical and liturgical environments in which some of these items were deployed. Another focus of this work consists with the tradition of the Armenian Mkhitarist monasteries in Venice and Vienna. It has entailed discovering forgotten manuscripts, including a particularly fascinating example of a melody not otherwise preserved, that is found at the Library of Congress, where I was recently invited to lecture about it. Connections between the transcriber was the Venetian musician Pietro Bianchini, and one of his own compositions, his Symphonia of 1862, where the same motif appears, and some hitherto unknown correspondence between Bianchini and one of the Mkhitarist fathers in Paris, from which we can see what was the reaction of the Mkhitarist circles to a European musician coming and transcribing and trying to give fixity to their melodies and harmonizing. Hitherto we knew that in the Caucasus there was resistance to harmonization, but it appears that in San Lazaro also there were different arguments against and in favor. These arguments reveal very much about the mindset of some of the contemporary actors. And it was indeed an era of titans, people like the poet Levent Alishan, Haig Utidjian, Pietro Bianchini himself, who has now been forgotten by Italians to a large extent and is remembered by Armenians. So you see the exchange and the enrichment was in both directions, both from the West into the Armenian tradition and the other way around. Part of this work has also involved in the achievement of glyphs of the Limongian notation system as part of the Corpus Musicae Ottomanica project at the University of Münster, through the efforts primarily of my colleague Jacob Early and others, and I'm happy to say that this system is now in the public domain and is available to anyone who wishes to make use of it. What we need to do is to collate the numations of chants, to establish criteria to distinguish between meaningful variation in medieval manuscripts as opposed to mere scribal error, to expose connections between manuscripts and the ediciones principes and address a number of paleographical problems. A digital inventory of neumes from a multi-genre corpus may then be developed to allow what is known in science and in software engineering as a high-throughput approach to be implemented. A sizable file incorporating neumes and verbal text together may then be suitably interrogated with special software in an iterative manner to discover more about the structure and flow of the melody and its relationship with the words, not perhaps sufficing to decipher the medieval neumes and reconstruct medieval melodies, but exposing, for example, which neumes are apt to arise in which particular formal contexts and thus help us clarify their function. I mentioned medieval Armenian manuscripts. They have, of course, been central to my work, and medieval manuscripts and early publications have been something that, thanks to the Armenian embassy, we have been able to present to the public, to the Czech public. In 2016, there was a memorable exhibition at the Clementinum involving the National Libraries of Armenia and Prague, and more recently, in 2018, at the Theological Hall of Strahov, there was a collaboration between the Armenian Embassy, the Vienna Mkhitarist Congregation, the Madinatarani Institute in Yerevan, and private lenders. I have been privileged to serve as curator of both these exhibitions, and these have in turn led to the development of a course, because these activities serve to enrich the teaching that one is able to offer at the philosophical faculty or the Faculty of Arts. And there have been monographs, and there are several more in the pipeline at the moment. Further areas of recent research are that of hymnal illumination, exploring how this genre displays certain peculiarities not found in the much better studied genre of Gospels, for example, lectionaries, and the Armenian tradition of Marian devotion in visual culture, in music, in theology, in poetry. And one interesting question that has arisen, which I have been trying to address, is the fact that the interactions between the East and West have informed and enriched the Armenian tradition, but there are parallels as well as contradistinctions in the realms of manuscript painting as opposed to music, in turn as opposed to theology. A project that is very much in its nascent state is the Komitas project. I have been working on it for several years, but it's still early days. The thing is, I have been engaged by the museum, the Antonin Dvorak Museum, to study all the extant manuscripts of the Dvorak Mass in D, the Luzhanska Mass, and most recently the composer's sketches for the Mass in D, which was recently published by Berenreiter. Having done this work, I was inspired to feel that similar work is required for a masterpiece of comparable stature in the Armenian tradition, namely the Divine Liturgy as arranged by Archimandrite Komitas. The Komitas Divine Liturgy is a masterpiece. It is a work of considerable artistic value, not merely Armenian, but for the whole of humanity. It is of enormous iconic significance to Armenians, of course. And if we study the manuscripts and the sketches, we can gain insights into Komitas's musical thinking and clarify the various stages in the development of the work to present these to scholars and performers in a lucid manner, exactly in the same way as I have done in the case of Dvorak's Mass in D. One early fruit has been the discovery and translation into both Armenian and into English and publication of a fascinating article by the Greek Constantinopolitan musicologist and musician Georgios Pachtikos, which was recently published in Armenia and in Prague, and the preparation of a performing edition of a version of the Komitas Divine Liturgy for strings as a concert suite by the very fine, sadly now late Armenian violinist, conductor, and chamber music professor Zarek Sahagians, of which I was honored to conduct the European premiere. This corresponds to a period when in Soviet Armenia it was not encouraged that a mass be performed in a concert setting or published as such, but a concert suite was a very, very interesting way of getting around that and making this highly spiritually charged work available to the public. It is in a sense the opposite of the phenomenon that Komitas himself was involved in, for which he was bitterly criticized in his lifetime, namely performing choral extracts from the Armenian Divine Liturgy on the concert stage. Here is a slide of a recent performance of this in Vienna at the Mkhitarist Monastery with members of the Charles University Orchestra and myself. We have some longer-term translation projects in progress as well. I have been translating with Martina Pičmanová the complete odes of St. Gregory of Narek into Czech, and Luděk Liška has been rearranging these to make them read as beautiful Czech poetry whilst remaining faithful to the original. We have started a translation of the Book of Lamentation, hoping that Providence permits us to complete it in its entirety into modern Greek. And we are also working on an annotated English edition of Archbishop Malakia Ormanyan's Choch Yev Chosk, which are of exceedingly great historic importance and very great interest. All this work would not have been possible without ongoing international collaborations with distinguished colleagues in Copenhagen, London, Cambridge, Catania, and Estonia, and I'm very grateful to them for being open to our collaborations, and I'm very grateful for their help. Now, what is the benefit of this for the broader public? Dissemination. There have been numerous recent publications, both in popular journals, popularizing articles in the pan-European magazine Horaire and elsewhere, but also in international peer-reviewed journals. A lot of lectures in various places, art centers, libraries, academies of sciences, including the Library of Congress and elsewhere in the United States and throughout Europe. Within the Czech Republic, popularizing programs, Radio Vltava, Czech Television, ČT1, Dvojka, 24, ČT Art, and so on. We have a Facebook group, Arménské dějiny a literatura. Most recently, less than a year ago, there's a YouTube channel devoted to Armenological research, amongst other things, with a growing number of subscribers and viewings. Podcasts, most recently for the St. Vladimir's Seminary Luminous series, which only a couple of weeks ago featured the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And, of course, not least, lecture courses. Some of these have been presented one at a time at the Faculty of Philosophy and Arts at Charles University, but also at the Armenian Institute in London, and via the Armenian Institute, tuition is now being offered in ancient Armenian to students at the University of Princeton and at the University of Cambridge. This podcast, by the way, will be made live in, I believe, 2 weeks, so you can look forward to it. If you look at the Sacred Arts Institute pages on St. Vladimir's Seminary, it will be there, with Professor Peter Utenev. This brings us finally to teaching and teaching philosophy. Now, somewhere like Prague, which used to have a proud tradition of Armenian studies and teaching, but which was in abeyance for very, very long and had become a caricature of itself, it behoves us to have courses that are at the same time suitable for beginners, yet at the same time are informed and enriched by cutting-edge research. So no linguistic prerequisites are insisted upon, except of course for advanced semesters of language tuition. Fresh readings of primary sources in original languages are exploited. Parallels with sister traditions, including where appropriate, the Czech tradition, are exploited. Again, much in the same way as research, in teaching also it is very beneficial to consider ideas, images, and music in tandem with each other. One has to be flexible, one has to question, one has to seek out connections and analogies. And of course, something that I tell my students all the time, we have to read between the lines, because thinkers of the past often refrained from stating assumptions that were held in common and tacitly presupposed, and therefore deemed not to warrant explicit mention. These are some of the courses that I have devised and taught since the resumption of Armenian Studies at the faculty, but also further afield. I just want to express particular satisfaction and my gratitude to the Armenian Embassy for supporting courses in Western Armenian, because the Western Armenian language is an endangered language. And it is, I think, very significant that it is taught here. But all these areas have been well represented. A few concluding words about this chair. What is a chair? One is reminded, if you will briefly allow me to be a little more light-hearted than the main tenor of my speech. It is said that after Lord Dunsany had been appointed to the Byron Chair of English at Athens in 1940, he was asked by a well-wisher what exactly this chair was. And apparently he responded, "I don't know, but I'm paid to sit in it and it is very comfortable." Needless to say, this is certainly not the case with the Armenian Chair in any respect. But I think that it is valid for us to ask ourselves, what are the perspectives? What are the challenges? What are the limitations that we must try to overcome? And of course, most positively, what are our hopes? Well, above all, I have to express my gratitude to the Armenian Embassy for the revival of teaching at the philosophical faculty at Charles University, the Faculty of Arts, as it is now translated. We have to bear in mind, however, that generations were brought up with very limited knowledge. What little trickled through Soviet channels in decades after the premature passing of Ludmila Motalova, which is nothing short of a tragedy for Armenian studies in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. We have to benefit from the Czech tradition of presenting already established knowledge to local readers, but we need to be clear as to what is original research and what is not. Both original research and popularization and dissemination of already existing work have a role, but clarity must be maintained. It is desirable to create a viable course to allow a student, without having to stay at the philosophical faculty for 12 years as a student, to attend a sufficient number of courses so that they can be deemed to be potential Armenologists and engage in serious original research in the area. Now, funding is of crucial importance. Securing and respecting expertise is of equal importance. And student enrollment is something that is of vital importance. So far, I'm happy to say that our low student numbers have been compensated, or perhaps more than compensated, by the very high caliber and motivation of students enrolled, but it would be desirable to make available the fruits of our work and infect with our interests a larger number of students as time goes on. I very much hope that will happen. There are also challenges posed by difficulties with repositories of medieval Armenian manuscripts, for example, but on the other hand, the National Library of Armenia has been exceedingly generous in making available all their treasures, including much rare material not available elsewhere, through the internet. Of course, libraries are not just digital files, and I'm very grateful to the National Library of Armenia, to the Armenian Embassy, and to a number of other bodies for their generous help in building up a good library of Armenian Studies volumes at the philosophical faculty. Cataloguing is of greatest importance. The Embassy have been active in that as well at the philosophical faculty, and I myself have personally catalogued the Armenian holdings at the Oriental Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences. Armenian Studies requires no special pleading and needs to be established on solid academic foundations above all, solid philological foundations, just as Greek and Latin deserve the same, and not merely as regional studies. Now, political benefits accruing from the Armenian Chair are important, as you can imagine, all the more so at a time when Armenia is threatened, at a time of war. Armenia can compete with culture, not with oil. But these political benefits will be all the stronger if they arise from a solid academical foundation, and I believe that all stakeholders, all parties involved, those financing, those hosting, as well as my modest self, will do our utmost to ensure that that is indeed the case. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.